here, but just to remind everybody, we're here for basically the last run at looking at any potential comments we'd like to make to Echo Northwest before we proceed. On the 27th will be when the final draft is then sent in. I know previously we've had some feedback on the draft that was sent prior. We had some of the committee members send some feedback, so I'm sure Echo will elaborate on that today. Everybody knows who I am, Harris Ryback, co-chair of the FWC here, and then Craig, I'm not sure if he's on right now, but he will be popping on at some point. We have Todd. Let me see, am I looking? Okay. Hey, Aaliyah, is Todd in here? I mean, I see his name on here, but it says like
he is not. I do believe that Doug Denning is going to be helping us out with this.
Okay,
today.
yeah, that's kind of what I thought. I just saw there was a list of, it says people added to the chat 12, and I was like, some of these people, I don't know if they're even in the meeting. But anyway,
yeah.
Doug, okay, so Doug Denning is here to help assist as well, along with Derek Disney is also on. So we appreciate those folks for joining. Then also we have obviously Echo Northwest here to provide kind of an update. So before I pass it over to Echo, I can give just a brief kind of update on where things are at leading up to this point. So kind of working with John Whiteley and some different feedback we got, myself and Craig and Todd and Derek, and we had all kind of talked about potential options moving forward in terms of the manufacturing sector kind of making its way, I don't want to say back into the study, but definitely not kind of eliminating it altogether. And so the study that we're still going to finalize is definitely from the woods to the gate of the mill, as we had talked about. But then, as you'll hear, Echo will kind of elaborate on, we're looking at some sort of sub-study that can be added to this that does add some factors that involve manufacturing and production that some folks thought would be relevant and needed. And so, and both Craig and I and Todd, we didn't feel like there was an issue with bringing that back in. But I think it was really important to make note of that's not being brought into the study we're going to see today. We are still proceeding with our initial direction to Echo Northwest, you know, in the past that said, hey, stop what you're doing thus far in terms of product and manufacturing information into this study, and then proceed with, you know, from the woods to the gate of the mill kind of deal. So that's still proceeding as normal. However, there's some biennium money that has been looked at that we can potentially use on a much smaller scale to kind of do a sub-study of some of the manufacturing production, just to kind of round things out. But what you're going to see today, I believe, will be just the draft that we saw prior, which is excluding the product and manufacturing piece. Any questions before I pass it over to Andrew or Melissa at Echo to kind of talk about any changes they've made since the last time? Okay. With that said, well, let's see. Opening remarks. Any public?
Hey, Harris.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just got a text that John Whiteley's having trouble getting in and maybe calling in, but just a heads up.
Oh, okay. With that said, Aaliyah, I guess just keep an eye out for that coming through. Thank you, Doug.
I will try calling him from this meeting right now.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And then also no public comment, I assume, Aaliyah?
No public comment, and we are at quorum.
Great. And then anybody like to approve the minutes from the May committee meeting? I'll ask for a motion and then a second.
Co-chair Pope moves.
415800169.
Was that a second from that number?
I'll second.
Okay. So that was Craig that moved in. Who was it that seconded? I'm sorry, I missed it.
This is Mindy Crandall. I'll second.
Okay, thank you, Mindy. Appreciate that. So as long as we have that documented, thank you guys. Craig, I don't know how long you've been on. I just kind of gave him a rundown of where we're at and whatnot.
I got it all. We probably got to have a vote on that motion.
Yeah.
We need to vote on that motion.
On what
we-
motion?
The motion to adopt the consent agenda.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I got a motion in a second. All in favor of that?
Aye.
Either raise your hands or say aye.
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 Okay. Aaliyah, as long as you're able to kind of count up any opposition, any opposed, any abstentions. Okay. That passes. With that said, it's 10:06 and we had no public comment. We approved the May meeting minutes. So with that said, Andrew or Melissa, if you want to take it from here and any support that you need or any kind of information, feel free to open it up to the committee. And then, like I said, Doug and Derek are also on to provide any kind of logistical information if needed. So.
Great, thank you, Harris. Yeah, and so I have today prepared some slides. They're drawn from the executive summary, which was just very recently distributed or will be in your inbox fairly soon. Based on the report draft that we sent out a little over a week ago, and did receive some feedback by the end of last week, and we have not made major changes based on that feedback. We've just gotten it, but wanted to have this conversation today before we went into report revisions. And so really want to spend as much time as necessary today hearing from you, the committee, input you have on the report draft. Again, do have some slides, but happy to start, whatever's top of mind for people. So we'll give you a quick reminder of the timeline for finishing the report. It's very short, and then the balance of the time for discussion. Today is Tuesday the 17th. We're having a meeting to discuss the report based on the feedback received from committee members prior to the meeting and whatever we discussed today. We plan to deliver the final report next Tuesday, about a week from now. And then I understand there will be a final vote on the report subsequent to that delivery. So that's the timeline. Then beyond that, first slide here is just the report outline. I can just briefly describe what we have in each of these. And again, I will pause. We can take questions, start talking about whatever's top of mind. Alternatively, I have some slides to walk through what will become the executive summary, but leave that up to the interest of you, the committee. So we have, you saw the draft, we have a study draft. First chapter was titled Oregon's Forest Operations and Management Sector, where we really try to describe the very relatively large and complex nature of the sector that we're looking at, talk about some of the major activities that happen there, the regional distribution of activity of the sector across the state, and many other characteristics. Chapter 2 is our workforce analysis, where we pull apart what we can based on the available data, acknowledging in many places that the typical sort of administrative data sources we would rely on for this kind of analysis are insufficient for the sector we're looking at. And so, as you all know, we conducted some additional engagement through a survey to try to collect some additional information to round out the gaps in the available data and put all that together into the workforce analysis. Third chapter was a programs and pathways analysis, another area where the available data are really insufficient to fully characterize what's happening on the ground in terms of programs and activities that support the industry workforce. But we describe at different levels from K-12, CTE into post-secondary, some engagement with workforce boards, our perspective of what's happening on the ground with respect to programs that can or should support the industry. And then finally, chapter with conclusions and recommendations drawn from the material. So I will pause there. Happy to take questions. Again, feel free to jump in. Very interested in hearing any additional feedback from the committee.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I had a question. Initially, when we got sent the study draft, it was indicated that HEC would be compiling all of the feedback, and that was going to be sent to us yesterday. And I didn't see anything come into my inbox. So I was just curious when we'd be seeing that consolidated feedback.
I think so. We received the feedback. I think that would be a question for Heck.
This is Doug. I can double check with Todd, but I think if I remember reading the email correctly, he was going to consolidate the information and get it to Echo. And if it didn't go out to the committee and it was supposed to, I will follow up with Todd a little bit later today and make sure that happens.
Okay, yeah, it would have been nice to see kind of the consolidated feedback to prepare for this discussion. And I have the email open and it did indicate that Echo would get it and we would get it. So, so that's fine. I mean, we're all going to discuss here, but just wanted to follow up on that. It'd be nice for transparency's sake to be able to review that.
Yeah, I agree. I think what I was referencing is I think it was maybe a couple drafts back when like we had got something from, it was either Echo or the Heck that had like a breakdown of all the feedback, Amanda, but I think that wasn't as recent as the last draft. So I know it had been done prior, so I don't see why maybe it wouldn't have been done now, but thank you for that feedback though. Julie?
Hi, I was also wanting a clarification since we just received the executive summary this morning, an update of when that feedback needs to be completed by, because I think that's one that's important, knowing that that's often what a lot of people read. If you can update on when that review could be done by.
Well, we owe the final report by next Tuesday, so we need it in advance of that. I'd say as quickly as possible if you have input on the executive summary.
And next Tuesday is is that the 24th?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think kind of the comments and recommendations that come out of today, depending on Echo's approach to needing more or any kind of formality in terms of changing anything that you see today. Yeah, I mean, to get that to them as soon as possible, getting it to them as soon as possible would be ideal. So. Any other questions on this first slide on kind of just a breakdown? Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Yep. All right, so moving on. Again, these slides, there's a lot of words. I apologize, and I realize you've just gotten the executive summary, but most of it is drawn straight from the executive summary. There is more in that document, but this has the highlights, and so I'll spend, with each of these slides, just a brief overview of what's in them, what's behind them. If the committee wants to read the words and talk about them right now, that's great. If not, we can just keep moving on. But I will pause, to give people time to absorb a little bit. Again, the first chapter, Forest Operations and Management Oregon, what we're trying to do is describe the sector, the activities that are involved, the types of entities, whether they're sort of formal employers, self-employed, or small family businesses that operate in other domains, and kind of set the landscape for the subsequent workforce analysis. And we ended up, in terms of the definition, from a sort of administrative data perspective, relying largely on classification developed by OED and in collaboration with OFRI and others. But extended in some important ways, and thank you to Amanda for suggesting some of those ways. Ended up characterizing the sector and discussing in a little more detail than is here, sort of 5 different types of activities, and kind of set the landscape for the subsequent analysis. So I will pause there to see if this triggers feedback based on the report, or if there are specific concepts on this slide here that you'd like to discuss or weigh in on. Happy to take that feedback.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I don't want to reiterate all the comments that I made in my kind of reviewed document that I sent to you guys. So I'm going to try my best not to do that, so we can use this time most efficiently.
Yep.
But one area that I commented on and just wanted to bring up here was there's no real like methods section. There's sort of information about the methods in which you guys utilize to get to the workforce numbers and the information and the data. But I just wanted to kind of put it on the record here that having sort of a method section where it more clearly defines how you guys got there might be useful to the reader. It was a little bit confusing to me, having been a part of the study, but I can see all the pieces there in this section, sort of defining these parts of the sector, highlighting the definition of OED or OED for the forest sector, bringing in a little bit of the information from the OFRI forest report, but and some of the tables and stuff. I thought all that was fine, but it still wasn't as clear as I thought it needed to be given the complex nature of it, which I know is not an easy task. But I just wanted to highlight that. I think the way that you guys broke down the subsectors makes sense to me in the sector. And I know that was part of a collaboration that we did as part of the survey, trying to kind of highlight what makes sense as far as the sector definitions. But just wanted to kind of notate that. I don't know what type of opportunities there will to be within the time frame to kind of maybe massage that into a more methods focused section. But just wanted to highlight, see if there's any response from you guys at ECHO or any other folks on the committee if they had thoughts around that.
So I'll just jump in very quickly. Yes, your comment was noted. I think that's a fair point, and I think there's certainly something we can do to describe in one place a little bit more about the methods. But as you point out, we are not in a position to sort of rewrite whole sections, obviously, and interested in from anybody feedback on, hey, this is critical versus nice to have, fatal flaw versus sort of minor. But open it to the committee for other input.
Any other input on these definitions, these sector definitions, if you will? Personally, I think, as Amanda said, I think in terms of kind of capturing kind of each of these sectors and kind of organizing them in the way you did, I think I like that. It makes a lot of sense. It's clear and concise, and I think it encapsulates a lot of what that industry has. And with that said, I also think that Amanda's comment makes a lot of sense, and I'd be curious to hear. Sound like maybe Andrew would look at a way to maybe incorporate that to some extent, but I think that's and that was part of your kind of initial feedback, Amanda. It sounds like, yeah. Just to kind of have an idea of maybe where some of that stuff came from. I know we were really heavy on not just wanting previous data, just kind of regurgitated onto this study, and I know that you guys really heard us on that, and it'd be interesting. I think it'd be productive to see kind of maybe where some of the stuff came from, if within the timeline, Andrew, that's at all possible. But feel free to elaborate on that if there's anything you'd like to add about that particular comment. But any other comments, questions, concerns, feedback on this slide? Okay. Does everybody else keep having stuff pop up on their screen? Okay, I'm constantly having like something I'm having to exit out. I don't know if it's somebody trying to get in or they're chatting or what it is. But anyway, go ahead, Andrew, if there's no other further feedback. Craig, did you want to add anything? Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
Yep. And so I would say, again, the report obviously has a lot more detail and open to feedback on not just these classifications, but the material presented in that, in that chapter.
Sure.
And we can always circle back, obviously. Okay. Also part of that chapter, we have so I do have a little bit more on that. discuss some of the additional community benefits of forestry operations and management. This has been described as an interest in the beginning. This is a small summary here, but I just sort of broken down into a couple of different categories. Forestry operation and management provide a wide range of community benefits. We talk about sort of the benefits of some of the revenue that feeds into the local communities and the state coffers as well. Some of the other activities associated with well-managed forests, biking, hunting, etc. Also talk a little bit about how the sector delivers critical ecosystem services that protect communities, sort of thinning and prescribed burns to reduce wildfire risks, et cetera, et cetera. And so feel that's an important component of describing the sector beyond just sort of the demand of the entities that are actually working in the sector to provide a more comprehensive picture. So again, we'll pause here to take any feedback on this. Again, these particular words, or the slightly longer discussion in the main report draft.
Okay. I do want to say real quick, and I apologize specifically to Rachel. Let me backtrack slightly. We're still definitely in the same realm of related discussion, but Rachel, Rachel, go ahead. You can kind of reiterate what you had put in the chat. I think you should be able to unmute and speak, but I think it'd be better for you to just kind of elaborate on some of the stuff you put in the chat versus me kind of reading your, unless you're having a hard time with your microphone. Maybe that's it. I don't see here in the chat.
I think it's on.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay.
I want to interrupt for just a second here, though, as a co-chair. This is a committee meeting. We had a public comment portion, Rachel. Maybe you weren't on, but please, you're interrupting a committee process. So please get your statements very brief and let's move on.
Mr. Pope, it was a comment about the categories. You were talking about the categories on the previous slide. I was just stating that the firefighting, as far as job purposes go, could be in a category for emergency services. It's not a full-time job. It's not a sector. It is a sector, I guess, but it's a part-time on-call emergency service. It's its own classification. And then the transportation is generally part of contracting, and it goes along with the same job duties as a fuels reduction or general contractors that are hired to do forestry work. So the transportation job duties would go along with the contracting. To make it separate would be to separate a job position for one company. That's it. That's my comment on your classification.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Okay.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. So I appreciate the input there. Again, interested in feedback on the community benefits discussion. And if none, happy to move along.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, one comment I just wanted to reiterate that I made in a previous, when we were talking about kind of the survey results and the engagement results that we got, those previous documents, is just a kind of a finer point on the relation between forest contractors and forest operators who are also providing community benefits as firefighters who have incident resource agreements and Viper contracts. There's some kind of information in the workforce section, but I feel like as a community benefit, that is also really important and a point that we're often trying to make, in that, if one goes away, they both go away, and there's a community benefit to have a robust forest sector and forest operations because of all of the in-kind services on firefighting that landowners, mills, and loggers provide for the benefit of the public. So that kind of public safety piece, I don't know, it's in here, but I don't know that it's kind of clearly, there's kind of a clear demarcation on that piece.
So then, I mean, your suggestion would be just to maybe expand on that piece a little bit, or just to clarify, because we do mention public safety. We mentioned in this slide, you know, there's the fire prevention and thinning, which is, I know what you're saying is a little bit beyond that. But.
Yeah. So I think, you know, there's risk reduction associated with kind of those types of operations, right? With thinning, prescribed burning, just active forest management. Road building is another piece that's critical for wildfire reduction, to have adequate ingress and egress for emergency services. But on top of that, the folks that are doing that thinning work may also be doing the suppression work. And I don't know that the public and that legislators that may be reading this report really understand that connection between those diverse services. And again, we kind of get to that multifunctional, kind of multimodal company that's out there. But this conversation around in-kind services that are provided by the industry at large that may otherwise look like they just do, you know, active management, they often have their own firefighting apparatuses that are then utilized in the firefight when needed. And so I don't know that that point is really clear, and I don't want people to have to read between the lines to get there.
Well, actually, and your in kind is a key part of that. I think. I mean, we in the workforce analysis, we get the multifunction that your aspect of the industry that you're mentioning, and obviously do not dwell on all of the specific combinations because there are so many. So thank you for the input, and I think we can we'll see if we can do something here. It doesn't suggest to me a big body of text, but maybe it's just calling out that particular connection.
I'd like to ask just real quick to Aaliyah, did John ever come in? Is that number that ends with 95?
I do believe that is John, yes.
Okay. With that said, any comments on this particular page? Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. You know, there's a sentence here about communities also benefit from recreation and non-timber forest products with activities like camping, biking, hunting. And I'm just trying to get a sense of what exactly that's trying to say. I mean, I would say that, you know, forest operations often facilitate opportunities for recreation, you know, non-timber forest products and activities in the woods. So can you help me understand that sentence and what it's trying to say?
Well, essentially, just to, I think what you summarized. I mean, it's articulating. There are timber operations. We can cut down trees. We can harvest the wood. But beyond that, having the existence of forests that are particularly well managed forests, with well maintained roads, trails, et cetera, provide a lot of benefits to individuals in the communities. They attract people from other communities, which provides economic benefits to communities near the forests and so on, and just trying to get at those additional benefits that are, I don't want to say secondary, but they're provided by the forest's existence as well managed forests, beyond just the logging operations and so on. Does that help?
Yes. Did that suffice, Nick, or did you have kind of?
I think so. It's just kind of the way it's laid out. It suggests that these other sort of non-timber activities are completely separate from timber, when I think, as you mentioned, good forest management, well-managed forests provide a number of values in addition to timber. So that's all I have.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's the intent, and maybe there's a tweak that we can do to make that a little more clear. But.
Thank you. And then who was Courtney? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's because this was an area that in the full report, it's not that I saw anything that I could point to as being wrong with it, but in that recreation benefit section, there was sort of a value assigned to sort of the emotional experience of recreation. And I was trying to get a sense of, how to look at a workforce report and sort of economic analysis and gap analysis where that emotional value was being brought in as something attributable, because we don't see that necessarily in the other areas of value that maybe a forester might find in inventorying. Or and so that was a place I was just pondering, like, how do you talk through that if somebody's trying to value emotion someone's having in the experience as data?
Right. Yeah. No, I don't know if we use the word emotion or not, but I think I think that the discussion is about here is an estimate for the sort of a dollar value of. It's not people paying money for permits and so on,
Yeah,
but it's an
I
estimate of
think
the
it's
dollar
that,
value, and that. Yep.
that they value from their recreational experiences above what they spend, the enjoyment of natural beauty and solitude. I mean, that's emotional, and those are words in there. So I think that's a place of caution in this, trying to understand the linkage and what we're actually inferring is occurring.
Yep, and we can take a look at that, but it's actually sort of a standard economic practice to try to estimate in dollar terms the value people place on having an amenity nearby or having access to an amenity, and there are rigorous techniques for doing so, and it's possible some of the language may or may not have gotten a little flowery, but again, it is based on data, and it is and based on well-researched rigorous methods for establishing those dollar amounts. And I think part of your point is that I work in the woods, and I probably have some similar kinds of emotions about the value of these forests. And true, that's not accounted for here, but I think part of this is here's some additional benefits that have been quantified that we can quantify of having nearby well-managed forests.
That's helpful. Thank you.
But we can definitely take a look too.
Thank you, Courtney. I appreciate that. And thank you, Andrew, for elaborating on some of that stuff. Any other questions on this particular piece from any committee member?
Can I comment on the job activity?
Rachel, we're kind of running on a timeline where kind of one of my initial plans was maybe wait until the committee can provide feedback on the various slides we see that are presented here by the contractor, and then if there's time to maybe loop back around. We did have that public comment portion where I had asked for any public comment, and like Craig said, I don't know if you weren't on then or what, but that would have been really the good time for you to kind of gather these and bring them up. So
Okay, yeah, I was just asking if the workforce means jobs, because the purpose of forestry is to make a beautiful and healthy forest, whether people like it or not.
sure.
That's
Sure.
it.
Thank you for that. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Andrew.
Yep. So just want to make sure that any other input on this or the associated pieces of the main report. Okay. So getting to this question of jobs, again, sort of pulling the threads together based on the readily available data and the less readily available data, we pulled together an estimate for the total number of individuals working in the forestry operations and management workforce. These come from a number of different data sources. On the left, we're looking at employers, most of whom need to report to the employment department. And those give us in particular the counts in the first couple of rows in the upper left, forest operations, forest management, transportation. Most of those numbers come directly from the Oregon Employment Department accounting of employers and employees. They also have developed a methodology to identify specific firms that may not be in those three formally defined sectors, but are clearly, according to their criteria, operating the forestry sector. That's another 784 individuals. I showed you up above the sort of 5 categories of operations, forest operations and management that we wanted to track. That included road maintenance, aggregate production, and so on. We did not provide counts here from the data because the sectors are relatively large and we don't have a good method for disaggregating directly forest related components to those, but the report appendix does provide counts there as well. So it would be possible to add additional numbers in. That gives us about 23,000 individuals. We also made some estimates of based on non-employer data, and these are entities, sole contractors, self-employed individuals, again, small family businesses that are not required to report to the employment department in the same way. There's much less data about these entities, but we took the available data published by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then applied a multiplier, just an estimate, but it's the best we have, based on our survey of non-employers, to come up with an estimate for the number of individual workers, non-employer workers in the industry and the sector as we've defined it. It's another about 9,000. We also looked at US DOT truck registration information, not a perfect source of data, but it does allow us to identify the number of trucking firms located in Oregon and their certifications. What are they allowed to carry? There's a lot of transportation firms, as you all are aware, that they may haul logs, but they haul a lot of other things. Again, through an imperfect method, but the best I think we could do, we come up with an estimate of about, again, almost 6,000 additional truckers. Add it all up, we end up with a little over 31,000 total workers in the industry in recent years. And then we disaggregated them as by type of employment down below. And we'll pause there to take any feedback on how we're characterizing employment generally.
So Andrew, Craig here. I haven't had a chance to look through this before this meeting. So is there going to be a slide or a section on the gap?
Well, we don't have, we know what's out there. The gap, we get at the gap in terms of what employers report they need, what survey respondents reported they needed, what we heard from the engagement, but we don't have a quantitative description of a gap, if that makes sense.
So wouldn't that be, I know it's late now, but wouldn't that be a really useful comparison side by side to know how far, how far behind are we? Are we gaining? Are we losing? And to me, in the workforce world, that's supposed to be how we focus on where we're spending our money and how we help encourage industry and education to fill the gap. And so there should have been some way for us to get an understanding in this report of the gap in each of these subsectors.
Well, yes, and the question is always the gap relative to what, and it's that what that we don't have a quantitative basis for developing. And part of that is just because we have of the various data limitations throughout the various sources here, but the counterfactual there is not something we could put together.
I will just add, very good point, Craig. I think it's easy to look at these numbers and and kind of have a certain feeling about the representation, but at the end of the day, I appreciate you kind of looping things back to the productivity that we're looking at getting out of a study like this. And that gap is significant because, you can see how many people are currently employed, but if you don't know how many should be or need to be, or how many people shouldn't or are not, then I think that's a crucial piece of info. And so, like I said, at this stage, I'm not sure what that feedback will produce, but man, I sure appreciate that, Craig. That's very important. And if there is any kind of info on that, or you could pull anything, Andrew, I think that would be a very significant comment or something to address if at all possible. In any way, I know, like you said, with the restrictions and whatnot of your data. But, let me go. Thank you. Let me go to Courtney, then Amanda. Courtney, go ahead. Oh, looks like you're still muted, Courtney.
Thanks. I think about how this report, once this report is done, then the goal is to figure out how to help it inform future updates and elements. This, the jobs component here, when I read it in the full report, I pulled up some of the OFRI forest sector job numbers as well, and I was trying to crosswalk them a little bit to think about when we do those updates, is there a way that we can easily crosswalk it to start understanding that gap and trend based on these numbers? And so when you all looked at those, these categories, do they cleanly crosswalk with how OFRI has been capturing job numbers, or are they a bit different?
Partially, but we have gone beyond what OFRI did, which, and Melissa, please step in where I get off base here. But OFRI is essentially using OED's methodology in terms of identifying sectors and individual firms. That's sort of mostly basically the column on the left. And then we've expanded that to look at non-employers, expanded based on a parameter derived from our survey, and as well looked at a broader definition of transportation. Many truckers are not captured in the formal employer definition that the OED would have access to, and that's that 5,800 jobs in the very middle of the table, or individuals. So this number does not align exactly with the OFRI report for some of those reasons.
Okay.
And I think, it's hopefully at least incremental progress towards a better characterization of the sector. And obviously, given all the data limitations, the real effort should be in figuring out how to overcome those limitations.
Thank you, Courtney. Thanks, Andrew. Let's go to, forgive me, I had it and I forgot. Was it Julie first, then Amanda, or Amanda, then Julie?
Yeah,
Julie
I put my hand up first, but I think Julie was going to respond to maybe Courtney's comment. So Julie, I'll let you go.
Yeah, and I appreciate Courtney bringing this up as we've been working with trying to dig into more data. What we did find some additional sources, but it resulted in 3,000 to 5,000, not substantial. Where we're talking about tens of thousands. But I think what really came out of it, Courtney, and what we've been saying and seeing, and what Andrew alluded to, is just the methodology that's not really there, that I think is the bigger picture. Isn't can we replicate finding these couple thousands, but it's more, do we have as agencies opportunity to look at methodology and try and find a more consistent way? And I think that's what needs to come out of this, is to that point. And then I would just say that many of the same numbers are here. It's just regrouping based on this. But my last point I just wanted to make is, one of the main goals of this study was a gap analysis. And so when I hear at the beginning something thrown out about we're going to jump into mills and manufacturing to do a similar study, when we really haven't even finished what I would say this study, and the main goal of this group was a gap analysis. And these were numbers that we essentially did have that we're looking at. We dug into a bit more, but numbers like a gap analysis we don't have and we didn't have. And so that was really, for me, a disappointment. And so I would encourage us to have a little more conversation about, do we if there's additional funding available, put that towards more of getting more numbers that we already have, or trying to take a study to get what was our initial goal, such as the gap analysis. So I'm just leaving that as an open conversation. Don't mean to derail at the slide we're at, but just felt it was appropriate to bring up with that conversation.
Thank you, Julie. Really appreciate that input. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. That's a good segue. There's, I think, more information and discussion probably on this topic further in the analysis too, around the last chapter. But just since Craig brought it up and Julie kind of is highlighting as well around the gap analysis piece, I think there is a lot of editorializing throughout the document around the uncertainty of where the administration is going and where policy is heading. And I think as it relates to a gap analysis, I think many in the sector, I don't want to speak for everybody, but at least for Associated Oregon Loggers, what we are hoping for, and maybe kind of a follow-up, and maybe there's even some narrative description that can be included, is not necessarily what will happen, it's what we need. So like we have estimates of what is needed on the landscape to create healthy, vibrant forests again and to reduce wildfire risk. We have the Governor Brown's Wildfire Response Council report that identified how many acres needed to be treated. We have the quantitative wildfire risk assessment from the Forest Service. We have the 20-year landscape resiliency strategy led by the Department of Forestry, a wildfire crisis strategy by the U.S. Forest Service. We have housing goals from the current governor. And so when you couple all of those things together, I think what the folks in the sector are really interested in is what needs to happen in the sector to be able to get there, not what are all of the political hurdles and uncertainties that we will never know until we get there. It's, how can we advocate for the actual need on the landscape? How does the industry need to change and adapt? And what does the workforce need to look like to be able to even get to where people say we should be going, right? And then let all the policy wonks and the lobbyists and the advocacy groups and the nonprofits, work together to try to figure out how we get there. But we all need to have that North Star of where we need to go to even achieve the things that we say we want to do. I think that's sort of when we think about the gap analysis, that's what a lot of us are really curious and interested in. And so obviously we don't have enough time to really analyze all of those things in this report, but there could be an opportunity to remove some of that language around the uncertainty from a political perspective and identify and highlight the things we've already done and point to some of these other reports and say, we know that there's really critical work that needs to happen out in the forests. And we know that we need to grow the workforce in order to do that. There are challenges, but this workforce is critical to be a focus of this state in order to achieve the goals we've already highlighted and identified are priorities of the state at large. So I think that's where a lot of us are trying to get to. And again, I don't want to speak for the rest of the committee, so chime in if you have similar opinions, perhaps. But that's kind of what I think about when I think about what a gap analysis would, could, should look like.
Yeah, well, thank you for the input, and did note that in your written comments as well. And I agree. It'd be much more satisfying to have some quantitative measures, and I think what you described, Amanda, in terms of removing or toning down the policy uncertainty and describing the anticipated future demands to reach necessary to reach a statewide healthy forest across the board that provide the benefits that we know they do. Seems reasonable. I'm not seeing in the resources we've had access to a quantitative basis that we could pair with these highly imperfect employment estimates and be able to really quantify a workforce gap in numbers, certainly within the constraints of this project.
Thank you, Amanda. Any other comments, concerns, questions, feedback on this slide? It's an important slide. Numbers speak, and so go ahead, Aaliyah.
Wrong button.
What's that?
I hit the wrong button. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, no problem. No worries. Anything else for Andrew or Melissa on this slide? I know we provided Andrew some good feedback on kind of our view of the numbers and maybe what we'd like to see in terms of a gap.
Yeah, so I think that this whole discussion about the gap analysis is very relevant and very important. And somehow, Andrew, you guys have got to figure out how to, at the very least, take the committee members' discussion points here and put them into the report so that it's recognizing we see this will not be complete enough. I think all the points that have been made here are exactly spot on to the purpose of the bill, the funding, and the work. And again, as a workforce board member and leader, these are great numbers, but it doesn't do anything for me if I don't have a backdrop of what I'm comparing it to and how I'm going to emphasize to the community colleges in my workforce board in my 4 counties. I'm not sure what I do with it. Now, perhaps we're not there yet, and more data is coming to show us. But I think it's going to be important that that the final report is acknowledging our statements and our concerns, because right now, and when we get to the 27th, if I don't see those things, I will be making a comment on the record that this is not complete, and we needed to have this information. I'm not sure how we're going to get there, and whether we can do that in this short timeline. But at the very least, I think it's important that your report acknowledges that members are expressing concerns.
Yes, we can certainly do that for sure. But I'm not seeing a quantitative basis for providing a comprehensive number for an industry gap.
Well, and I think we understand that because I know, especially non-employer based estimate of workers is kind of those numbers can be subjective and they're not maybe as solid as maybe the industry employment numbers. But I think nonetheless, if there was something that could be extrapolated out of that, it would be very helpful. We'll go to, I believe it was Chris first and then Jim. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to support what Julie said earlier. And if, to the extent that you're noting in the report that more work needs to be done, I would request that we focus on that, on drilling down. If there were to be continued funding for more work, that we focus on that gap analysis of the existing sectors and subsectors. Manufacturers have not asked for this work collectively. I don't know. I mean, maybe in your interviews with some manufacturers, maybe a couple of them did, but as a collective, manufacturers have not been asking for the state to do this workforce analysis work, and I would ask that you not proceed with that type of work unless collectively the manufacturers get together and say, yeah, you know what, we really like the work that was done for forest operations and management, and we'd like to do something similar. But that would probably come in another round of legislative funding down the road, and so I would just ask that be considered and not be a part of the highlight for further work.
Thank you, Chris. I do want to add too, I appreciate that feedback, because at the end of the day, it's important to remember when we did talk about that potential sub-study on the production and manufacturing of the sector, at the end of the day, it's the majority of the committee, I think, that would determine what any additional funding, if possible, could go towards. So it's a very productive committee meeting today, because they're getting feedback from Julie and Craig, Julie and Chris and others that are saying, hey, when we hear that there's potential additional funding, and that's going to be going toward production and manufacturing, I mean, the majority of the committee did agree on cutting that out prior. So I think I respect that, and I think that's definitely duly noted, that if there is any additional funding that way and an opportunity for some kind of sub-study, if there's big gaps here, that we make sure to address those. So thank you, Chris. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to just chime in on the gap analysis topic. I think, in terms of there being a quantitative basis, it's all relative. There are a lot of topics covered in this report that have a strong quantitative basis and not as strong of a basis. It doesn't prevent us from stating assumptions and contexts and attempting to quantify. And when it comes to gap analysis, I think I would
I'd point to Courtney made some good points. You know, there are some public policy positions that the state of Oregon, the governor's office, lawmakers have made around desires for the future for our forest lands that are going to require capacity in the sector. We also have some, you know, just some baseline projections that have been done for, you know, around, say, housing starts. You know, there's estimates around, best guesses around what are the trends for new housing looking out to the future. Those are quantitative. Those are things we can quantify, and we can come up with estimates of what would that mean for those needs. If those needs do hold fast, and we need to make sure our sector can support those policy positions, preferences in the next 5 to 10 years, it is possible to come up with some estimates of numbers. There will be error bars around those, obviously, caveats, assumptions. That goes into any kind of analysis of this type, I think. So I'm just saying that, not that I would expect, and I'm asking for us to do that, but I just want to make sure there's a proper context set that it is possible to do this work. It just wasn't possible within the scope of this report and the time we had. So on that note, I would like to see at a minimum, somewhere in the conclusions or the next steps sections, to kind of echo, I think, what was stated right up front of what we've talked about, and that is that a gap analysis wasn't possible, wasn't part of this report, but that it needs to be done still, or some attempt needs to be done to try to wrap our arms a little better around what are we up against in terms of future, so we can at least take a shot at what those gaps are and kind of the magnitude, and what are the areas where the biggest gaps are potentially going to be seen, so that whatever comes next, whatever work comes next, it'll make it easier to tear off of this and try to dive into those things that just weren't possible in this effort.
Yes, thank you. No, I appreciate that, and I agree with everything you said there. I think well, we can what the easy sort of low-hanging fruit there is to emphasize the need for additional work. We do have some recommendations related to data, and throughout the report note data gaps and so on. And with respect to quantitative data, yes, I don't want to say it's not impossible, clearly, but I think something like the housing demand, you know, we could do some work, try to figure out, you know, lumber 2x4s per house, et cetera. But the timber market is beyond Oregon, obviously, and so that's your error bars. And again, I think within this project, maybe we could have picked a subsector, but trying to look at the industry comprehensively. And a lot of our effort did go towards trying to expand our understanding of the data that are out there, things we could collect through the survey and so on. That yeah, a more comprehensive look would be a challenge. So in this current time frame.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So that's sort of the first chapter describing the sector and the business operations. The second chapter is about the workforce itself, where we started with sort of standard occupational classifications, recognizing that they're imperfect, had a lot of problems, a lot of gaps and so on, but do present our characterization of the data that are available. And this is just one of the charts from the report, made its way into the executive summary. But I think given the limitations I just mentioned, does make it pretty clear that a couple of things. One, maybe not surprisingly, the industry is relatively concentrated in certain occupations, and many of those occupations are largely occupied or heavily occupied by self-employed individuals, which is one of the data challenges. So looking at the truck drivers, in terms of employment, the industry employs a certain number that we can see in the data. There are a lot of those self-employed truck drivers that are also associated with the industry, and that was some of our subsequent data collection and analysis. So we'll pause here. We can talk more about the specifics here, but generally interested in feedback on that sort of that workforce analysis. I do have a little more information from it in subsequent slides, but we'll take feedback here.
Okay. I'm not quite sure on where to inject this comment, but it was a comment from John Whiteley. He might be having issues unmuting, maybe, or maybe I'm not sure. But anyway, if everybody's following the chat to some extent, Aaliyah did put on there a comment from John. Craig, I guess I'll ask you as a co-chair. Do we want to ask John's question, or do we want to stay? I mean, we eventually for sure will, but everybody can look at the chat and see it. Or do we want to kind of stick on the comments relating to this particular? I don't want to lose sight that, we're looking at this particular slide right now. We're asking for comments on that particular slide.
Well, John's on the committee. John's on the committee, and he should have access to talk.
Yeah,
and so
yeah,
if he has a communication problem, then that's a challenge. Otherwise, we can see the chat. It's public.
Right.
So,
well, John, if you can unmute, I just wasn't sure why. Aaliyah was giving a comment, but I'm looking here at the little. Oh, okay, John, go ahead. You might be able to unmute. Yeah, I see now. Go ahead. If you're talking, we can't hear you. I did see the little emblem next to your name. At first, it showed no microphone available, and then it showed a microphone available, but it was muted, and then it showed that the mute came off. But then,
how is this? Is this better now?
Okay, that you must have did the right combination, because yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so I was told that we weren't going to comment or discuss any further at the start of this. We weren't going to discuss anything about the additional process for manufacturing. And then it came in that if there was additional funds, it wouldn't be used for manufacturing. So I felt like it was fair for me to speak up. We initially, I mean, I don't want to go over the history here. Right now, I've asked for letters of support for an additional manufacturing survey, or at least reporting on the information that was gathered. The stuff was gathered. There will be a bunch of letters of support for that notion from manufacturers. I was asked to do that. Manufacturers, state legislatures. There's one in Todd's inbox in Brock Smith. Several manufacturers, educational, primary or secondary and post-secondary, that we should be allowed to utilize the information that was gathered from manufacturing. It shouldn't be excluded from the report. Okay, that said, so if totally understand any issues with having manufacturing in this report. However, it should not preclude us from, one, demanding what we asked for, and that was, you guys said you asked for a gap analysis and it wasn't delivered. I don't understand how it was not delivered. But that the fact that the gap analysis wasn't delivered should not preclude us from having access to a supplemental report that includes all the information that's already been gathered. And so I just wanted to make that comment and appreciate being able to express that. Thank you.
Sure. And I'll say thank you for that, John. I don't think we were necessarily, or the committee, correct me if I'm wrong, particularly, I think maybe Chris or Amanda or whoever else maybe had talked about that. And I know I was kind of leading the wording in terms of a potential sub-study, but I don't think it was necessarily taking the precedence of the lack of a gap analysis and kind of the manufacturing production piece. I think it was mostly looking at, as I stated at the beginning, this particular part of the study kind of goes back to the initial recommendation of the committee to say, hey, let's remove that from the study as it is right now. And then with that kind of in mind, it's looking at, okay, now what within that realm may or may not be missing. And it sounds to me like there's committee members that are saying, that presence of a gap analysis may be the piece missing. And in terms of kind of the comment with, existing data that's not being maybe elaborated on in here, that's another thing. You did make also a comment about, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it said something like maybe you're seeing that there's not a lack of a gap analysis. Maybe I was interpreting that wrong. But
No,
I just
I'm just saying that, you know, to me, I totally get the lack of a gap analysis. Here's all the jobs we have, but how many do we need to fill? I'm not sure where the gap analysis, and it's my own ignorance of what the contract says. Was that contracted in initially? Was that asked for in the initial ask? And if it was, it should be delivered. Not irrespective of what resources people have or the time constraints. It was agreed upon. If it was agreed upon, it was agreed upon. If not, it's an also. So just the process. It was more of a process question or comment. If we agreed to a gap analysis, there should be a gap analysis, irrespective of what prevented ECO or whomever from creating that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. Amanda, I think you're next up. Go ahead.
Okay. So as it relates to the workforce analysis chapter, and there's some reference to this in the previous chapter as well. There are some statements in here, a kind of causal statements, or what I read to be causal statements around decreases in workforce over a set period of time and relating that directly to mechanization. So I commented that. I'm sure that you guys saw that, Andrew. But just for the record, I just wanted to highlight that some of the job numbers in here, we've created sort of a new methodology. I think removing those job numbers would be important, just indicating that, logging jobs employment has decreased over a period of time, and then recognizing that, I put some numbers in here around what happened on federal lands, timber supply on federal lands between 1990 and 2020. There's kind of a different way that this part of the sector and this piece around mechanization as well, and technology advancements and innovation, as well as seasonality, is described in the workforce analysis chapter. That's a little bit different than it's described in the previous chapter. I don't know if there was just different authors in each of those places, but I would say that the way that both of those topics are described in the workforce analysis align more closely with the way that at least Associated Oregon Loggers understands both of those features. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think it's important that we can talk about trends, but where we are pulling from kind of older methodologies and older data, and even things like blogs where, that maybe isn't is a highly imperfect maybe data source. I think just talking about the trends and then highlighting, what identifying kind of what that may be related to, I think is important. But this kind of connection point of mechanization increasing efficiency, that is true, right? And productivity, that's very, very true. But that is not what caused, a decrease of, having the workforce in this sector. It really is more than having a decreasing by 75% of production on federal lands that really caused that. So whether or not we want to say that in particular, I don't particularly care, but it definitely shouldn't be written as causal from mechanization, where mechanization really has been a solution to the problem of recruitment. One that mechanization does not beget the job loss. We're not firing people because we're increasing our mechanization. We're increasing our mechanization because of a lack of interested workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, did notice that. Note your comments along those lines, and again, don't disagree. I think it is a question of phrasing. I think the claim really is, the only claim with respect to efficiency is that, or mechanization is, if you're more efficient, it takes less labor to do certain things, and not trying to tie the full decline to mechanization itself. So it might just be noting also the decline in federal timber harvest, or something along those lines, because total production has gone down clearly.
Yeah, and just one other comment before we go to Mindy is just, I know one of the ways that we try to explain some of this stuff, and we talk about there's a difference between capacity and employment or jobs. And so we may be increasing capacity while the employment numbers may be declining. And that's because we're getting better and more innovative with the technology that we're using in the field, and making sure that when we describe those things, that's not described as a negative or a bad thing for the workforce at large, but it's actually increasing the high skills, high demand, high wage jobs in this sector. And that, I think, is a good thing and should be really attractive for schools, whether they're high schools or post-secondary, for exploring and expanding programs for this sector.
Yes.
Sorry, I was muted. I said, thank you, Amanda. Go ahead, Mindy.
Okay, thanks, all. I just wanted to say I think we should avoid inferring any kind of causality, because obviously, increasing productivity per labor is an ongoing trend, and we have from a research perspective, it's been incredibly difficult to disentangle the policy shifts along with globalization. So I think just a very nuanced discussion, and this would go back to some of the other comments. Less backward looking and more forward looking is probably what we're looking for, and that will help us avoid some of those potential issues if we start talking about increasing in mechanization or decreasing in federal timber harvest. I was kind of waiting till we got to the pathways section because I haven't had a chance to get through the whole report yet, but I do just sort of want to reiterate that, at least from an education perspective, the looking forward is what we will really find value in this study, right? So how can we make sure that what we're doing and what we're teaching and who we're recruiting into our programs is going to help the workforce issue? And so I know we've had lots of conversation about the gap analysis, but I just wanted to sort of chime in that from a forward-thinking action item type perspective, that's the really critical piece. So however we can get information on that, I think, is essential.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful input. And the point, really, and I understand, I mean, there are this is why we're having feedback. The point was not to say mechanization is causing the employment decline, but just to comment on the trends towards mechanization, noting, efficiency gains and so on. But point well taken.
Thank you, Mindy. Any other questions, comments, concerns, feedback on this workforce analysis slide? Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, just a few more comments here. I know that it's referenced in some places. I can't find exactly where right now, but that the data that you guys collected, it does not include H-2B visa workers from my understanding, but there's some comments around that part of the workforce or segment of the workforce being really important to the work of this sector. So I remember seeing that in just one place, and it might be important to highlight that kind of everywhere that we talk about sort of seasonality and that we talk about different parts of this workforce. So I know that that's a big part of our work, and we do a lot of work in that space. Obviously, there's a lot happening sort of in that world right now. And so, it is a really big feature of the contracted sector. So, however we can kind of highlight that and that important, legal worker, I think is really critical. So, just wanted to highlight that sort of a comment. My second maybe question is, within this framing on the screen, it's a little bit confusing where some of the public employers may fall in this, in the public sector. I don't think that this is specific to private. I think this is like all of the employment. And so there's a kind of a question mark there as we think about, different different jobs and pathways into jobs. And, I appreciate you guys highlighting Department of Forestry and Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service. But, I commented about, OWEB and ODF&W and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries. And there's a lot of other agencies and public employment that is critical and a part of getting work done on the ground, that environmental compliance piece. And those folks, I would hope that they identify themselves as part of the forest sector. And so I was curious about that, as well as the tribal forestry. I wasn't sure how those parts were maybe incorporated or not incorporated into some of these workforce numbers.
Yeah, so there's a couple thoughts. I mean, points well taken. With respect to H-2B, employers who hire H-2B workers will report, and they should show up here, but we just can't disaggregate. And so they are reflected in the totals, but not separated out just because we can't. Although we do have a total count, that isn't disaggregatable. With respect to public sector, yeah, so for example, foresters, I think the entirety of that other industries yellow piece is public sector employment. So we did not pull out public sector employment here. And I say beyond the most obvious Department of Forestry, BLM, NOAA is not solely a forest related entity, although very important, and could not talk to every entity out there, and so don't have all that detail. But public sector is reflected in here; it's just not called out separately. Again, similarly H-2B.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. It might be good to just put a finer point in that in some of the narrative that other industries incorporates the public sector employment, just for clarity's sake, as people are looking at this data, because I assume if I had the question, other people would too. And then, yeah, did you guys look at tribal or try to collect any tribal natural resource employment information?
Not quantitatively, and I don't know, Jade, I think is on the call. Maybe you can speak to any conversations regarding tribal.
Well, we did talk to organizations like Lomokatsi who were, working on both education pieces and contracting pieces. I don't think that there was a kind of a formal effort to reach out to specific tribal groups that were doing this, but we certainly found that they were pretty well integrated into a lot of the other pieces that we were studying.
Okay, and I will add, just from the tribal side, I believe that the survey had gone out to, I know at least my natural resources department here, and I had inquired about that initially to Amanda in terms of tribal input and whatnot. So.
Yep, that's correct.
And did you receive feedback, Andrew, from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde that way in terms of natural resources?
Yes, there was a survey response. Yes,
that's what I thought. Okay, great, thank you.
And I think so, and that's noted in the report. We didn't call it out separately because it was one response. And
sure. Yeah, and just on the side note, I'll say thanks, Amanda, for thinking of the tribal Indian country, we call it that way, in terms of that representation. So thank you. Any other questions in terms of the workforce analysis slide? Been some really good feedback on this one, much like the previous slide. I mean, when you're presenting numbers to a group like this, you're going to get some good feedback that way in terms of real life feedback. So any other questions before Andrew moves on? Okay, thank you.
Okay. So related, similar part of this, we do a demographic analysis, again, for the pieces of the industry that we can identify in the data. And this comes from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, where we just were not able to use the same sort of categories that were presented up above, but we are able to see separately forestry and logging and support activities for agriculture and forestry, and look at the demographics of those workers. And I'd say main takeaway from this and some other Other information presented in the report is one, and this was, I think, Amanda's suggestion, there's a perception that the industry is just a bunch of old white guys. And while that's perhaps more true than for the state workforce as a whole, it's not true across the board. It's not, that there are more, obviously more diversity than that statement would suggest. And here you can see in the support activities for agriculture and forestry in particular, a lot of Hispanic representation, well in excess of what we see across the Oregon workforce overall, and as well relatively high female participation compared to other sectors of the industry. So I will pause there. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I have a quick question. In my ignorance too, might be more plain than I can see. But so when you look at, like, let's say on the supported activities for agriculture and forestry, so those percentages, you have 35 female, 35 Hispanic and Latino, and then 5% non-Hispanic or BIPOC. So then, I mean, that makes up, unless I'm looking at it wrong, that makes up a total of like 75% of the workforce, 75% of the workforce. So is the remaining 25 then just male or?
Well, so the way to read this is the green bars, which is female or male, is what the American Community Survey tells us. 35% female, 65% male. With respect to race and ethnicity, you have 35 plus 5%, so 40% Hispanic or non-Hispanic BIPOC, which leaves 60% white.
So should it read? I mean, like, should it read male and female, or male and female, or like? I mean, I know why you were segregating kind of the female piece, but if it's also incorporating the male numbers, unless I'm missing something, I feel like maybe I'm missing the interpretation of it somehow.
Well, so yes, I mean the race and ethnicity, the orange bar, the yellow bar include male and female. Does that clarify?
Yeah, it does. And then the green bar is just female?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Courtney, go ahead.
The question I had, and I kind of saw you were doing that. I had the same question of, could you throw the male bar on there? But I think you can get there if you look at it. The part I couldn't quite gather is the aggregate Oregon section. Is that just of population, or is it of some subsection of population?
It's the workforce, basically. So it's all industries, so not just forestry. Yep.
Okay.
Any comments on this one? Okay, hearing none. Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. So that takes us to the Chapter 3, Training Pathways. And in the report, we discuss a wide variety of programs from K-12, youth workforce, CTE, apprenticeships, post-secondary pathways. As the committee knows, we had a lot of trouble getting a lot of useful data, particularly in the K-12 space in terms of numbers, although we do have the number and location of CTE programs, but do discuss the relevant pathways of those types. We do have a fair amount of post-secondary data from a couple of different sources, and these data are, I think, important. There are some critical programs that feed into the industry. Overall, as you all know, the industry relies less on the sort of standard post-secondary pathways than some other industries. So more data and very important, but accounting for a smaller share of the ultimate workforce than in some other industries. So just have a couple of pictures from that work, and happy to take feedback on any of it. But this picture compares post-secondary completers of forestry associated post-secondary programs. These are community colleges and universities, in this case, public or private, and comparing the number of completers to workforce size. And I'd say this chart makes really a number of different points, but the main one is that Oregon has a very large forestry sector compared to its economy, compared to its population, compared to its post-secondary system. We have another chart that's not shown here that shows that as a result, the state seems to specialize to some extent in forestry-related credentials. A larger share of post-secondary completers in Oregon are in forestry-related programs than in a lot of other states that have not similarly large, but large timber industries. But because the industry is so big here, if we look at the share of the workforce, compare the number of completers to the share of the workforce, Oregon falls to the bottom. And I think that, as compared to Montana, which has a relatively small population, smaller industry, but can specialize in a few post-secondary programs, and you see a much larger ratio of, again, completers to industry. What I think this speaks to, though, is, again, because Oregon's industry is so large, the state will inevitably be dependent on not just its own programs, but programs across the region. And important to think about in program development, focusing on the specific needs of Oregon and places where Oregon has an advantage in programs, but not try to sort of grow every post-secondary completer that the industry needs.
So while Oregon has, such a large scale as you were speaking, is it the largest out of all the other states listed here?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But by a long shot?
I believe so. Certainly in terms of concentration, sort of share of the state's economy. I believe in total production as well. Others on the committee might know for sure.
And then one last thing I was going to add before you added that piece in terms of the scale is that, in the same note of gap analysis, it's interesting looking at this and seeing, where the needs are, where the lack of whatever that's not getting Oregon to that place. But I think the scale kind of throws it off for me, because it's really hard to compare then at that point if Oregon has such a larger scale that it sets it kind of at a place like this on the graph. It's kind of just a little difficult. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I'll feed off of kind of your comment there, Harris. Yeah, I think I noted in some of my comments how critical some of these pieces are, I think, for the follow-up work from this report, identifying that Oregon is not really paying its fair share into the workforce for this sector in Oregon. We really end up having to rely on travel into our state from other programs, other universities, other places to fill that workforce need. I think that's a really important sort of bottom line out of this chapter that, I think is really important. And, I've looked at other places. We do a lot of inventory and analysis of our workforce, even through other states and other kind of offices and programs in Montana and Georgia and in other places. And I talked with Dean DeLuca over at OSU quite a bit of like, how do we create more capacity at OSU to be that provider for the industry in its own backyard. So it's not to throw OSU under the bus, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity, I guess, is what I'm getting at. So I want to highlight that. I think this is kind of a critical piece of this specific chapter. But then I just wanted to highlight too, I reached out to Department of Education, and I put some comments in addition to these in my comments, but some of the nomenclature around career technical education, and I had some questions around, were some of the numbers that were reported like official programs of study? Were they elective programs? There's some very specific, education nomenclature that we need to make sure that we're getting right. So I've included some of that here in the chat for you guys to look at, Andrew. And then I'm gonna just put one more thing in here that I got from ODE and FNRL around the specific number of programs. I think you guys utilized some literature from 2013, which is significantly outdated. And so it's probably best to utilize current data from ODE. And I'm not sure if there was just challenges in reaching out to Reynold Gardner there, who manages the Forestry and Ag Career and Technical Education Programs of Study. But just wanted to highlight that. And he let that he was more than happy to have a conversation with you guys if you have additional questions, this week for getting more accurate numbers around career and technical education from the Department of Education side of the fence. So just wanted to let you know, I'm happy to make that connection if you guys were having a hard time making it.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate that. And we'll take a look. I don't think our program counts were old. I believe they're the most recent data, but maybe there's a number that's different that's embedded in there.
Yeah, I'll jump in. And Amanda, we've had conversations with Reynold and received the data from him for the quantitative part of the chapter, but I think the 2013 study was maybe referenced in the more literature review section. So we'll just make sure that those align and that we get rid of any older numbers that don't reflect the newest data, but we do have those. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that they're really important as it relates to trends, right? Like these programs are growing, right? And I think that that's an important acknowledgement, but there's still a long way to go to increase them across the state with equitable access.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, and again, backward looking rather than forward looking, but one of the pieces we did not get was any enrollment counts, specific to programs, which would be very helpful in thinking about what, how much more capacity the state would need.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate that. Any other comments on this particular slide? I do want to just touch real quick while we were discussing the gap analysis piece. I think maybe at the end, Andrew will just take a sec to kind of loop back around to kind of a mix of what the committee itself has been asking about the gap analysis, along with what John Whiteley was asking in terms of kind of it being in the initial contract. I think I don't want to sidebar yet, but I think at the end that might be something just to note, to just talk about what that looks like in terms of logistics and what was in the initial contract and whatnot to refresh us. With that said, any additional comments on this particular slide? I think it's really interesting, and I think that frankly, I think the scale of Oregon, I think throws off kind of the initial determination when you look at this slide. Right off the bat, my first thought was we need to be doing better, but then when you kind of add the scale of Oregon and that sector, it kind of makes it hard to determine what we're looking at. But any other comments? I don't know. I don't know what you guys could do at ECHO to change that. That's why I just throw that out as a comment. But
well, I just say, I mean, the companion chart to this shows sort of forestry completers as a share of the total, total number of people getting certificates, associates, et cetera. And there, Oregon looks better, although it's not the top of the comparison states. And so I think it's something between that and this picture is, makes the point that Amanda's making. I'd say, given the scale, Oregon is never going to look like Montana on this chart. It's just not feasible, but there's a lot of room between Oregon and Montana in this chart. So.
Sure. Okay. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, to that, I just because I agree those two charts next to each other are helpful. Do you think it's important? Because I don't think you include both in the executive summary. Is that worth doing to try and help people know what to do with this section? Or I know space is limited, or even some way to do them side by side, or.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We can look into that because they are two important sides of the same puzzle, and I think we were first the draft executive summary, we were struggling with size, but yes, that's good input.
Okay, Amanda.
Yeah, one other thing in here that I wanted to highlight, I can't remember if it was included, and I probably had a comment on this, but was around some of the unique programming that the Department of Forestry has with Department of Corrections through Coffee Creek and South Fork Forest Camp. And those are really, there might be other states that are doing that. I'm not familiar with every state's connection points, on adults in custody workforce development and pathways development, but I know that many of our members do hire folks out of those programs, and there's significant community benefits that come from having those programs and expanding those programs, having those folks with, lower recidivism rates. And there's a lot of really, really heart-wrenching stories of people that, have really just come out of really hard places and now are really engaged, highly effective folks that are in the forest sector. So I'm not sure that I saw that piece in here, and maybe that wasn't a part of the pathways discussion because it wasn't, it's not specific to like education, but it is a pathway into employment that is perhaps unique in this sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And certainly not part of this picture clearly, but I'll maybe defer to Jade or Melissa. The comments noted, I don't know if they've had a chance to fully digest them, but whether they came up, those programs came up in the engagement, or whether we may have addressed them already.
I don't know that they did. What I'm thinking, and Jay can speak up if they did, but what I'm thinking, Amanda, is could add a couple sentences about these types of programs and, adult workforce pathways, perhaps another topic, another subheading, just with a few notations about those types of programs. We can add that, no problem.
Yeah. There was some desire for some adult training programs that I think was addressed in the report. So I think we can add more to that as well.
Okay, time check. We have 24 minutes to conclude our business here. So I think we better move on.
Good. Yeah, so last piece on the pathways, as you know, we have detailed data from HEC on post-secondary pathways through Oregon's public institutions, community colleges, and universities. And it allows us to look at completers and their subsequent employment outcomes in the state. So a big caveat with this data that I understand the employment department will increasingly be able to overcome to some extent is that we don't see out-of-state employment, and we also we can't identify employment in the state for people who completed in other places. So that's missing, but what we can do is look at individual programs at OSU or a community college, et cetera, and look at what share of completers in these forestry associated programs end up employed in the industry. We don't have self-employment data either, and that's a much more difficult hurdle to overcome, but the data we have do allow us to provide some information about how frequently a completer ends up in employment by an employer within the sector, either in forestry. We've also looked at what we were calling forestry adjacent industries that include education, government, and sectors associated with conservation programs and management thereof. So we can look at employment outcomes. That's the chart on the left. On the right, we show a story that's pretty consistent with other data presented throughout the report, in that of these completers, those that end up in forestry operations and management tend to have higher wages than those that end up in other industries, which is an interesting point of tension based on the feedback. One of the things we heard from employers in the survey is that they have trouble with entry level, offering competitive entry level wages. And so there's an important tension where you have a relatively well compensated industry on average, but difficulty getting people into the industry in part because of difficulties in offering those competitive wages. And so happy to take feedback there, but I think Craig's time check, I think, is more important perhaps to move on to the recommendations.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, just a few quick comments around the completer. And again, there's more information in my comments here, but I was curious about where some of the apprenticeships are going. You had completed apprenticeships and apprentices in Exhibit 5, at least in the draft. I know that maybe the numbers are wrong, but definitely interested in that, because I don't know how many of those apprenticeships are actually feeding in and are pathways to work in this specific industry. So it could be a little bit, it could point people in a different direction than what's actually happening in reality. And because we don't have a specific, I think that one of the problems with the apprenticeships is that we don't have the occupations in this sector identified as, can't remember the specific language from BOLI, but they have to be like a designated occupation or something like that. And I think that's been one of our problems in getting apprenticeships. So I just want to highlight that's a piece that I think, I was a bit interested in, as well as like on the completer side, there's a lot of information, a lot of people identified as going into this industry from environmental science degrees. And it's not my understanding that most of those folks are actually going into this industry, supporting production forestry and forest management broadly. So that was a bit of a shock to me to see those specific degree pathways tied in with this industry. That's not my understanding of where those folks tend to go. So I don't know if there's any additional information that you guys can provide on why you associated those. And maybe Mindy, you have a response.
I did just have a quick response, Amanda, which is that we do hear, this is N=1 or N= anecdote, that a lot of our forest engineering grads get picked up by civil engineering. And so people are looking to natural resources grads more and more to fill what we would think of as traditional forestry roles. I was surprised by that too. So for what it's worth.
And these assignments are based on it's the imperfect NAICS-based industry codes focused on a subset of the sector. So we don't know what's actually happening with a lot of these people, but there are sizable numbers of completers in those environmental natural resources programs ending up in related industries. And that's maybe posing more questions for further research. It's possible we could say a little bit more, but I think that's sort of what there is. With respect to apprenticeships, yes, we would like to know too. The state has better data on apprenticeships than they were able to share or willing to share for this study. They also know employment outcomes. There are some challenges to matching those data. We were not able to get the information that would be necessary to show those pictures. I'm very interested in that piece as well. It's very important.
Okay, Andrew, move to the next one.
Okay. So this is essentially, whoops, sorry. In our conclusions and recommendations, this is just highlighting the gap analysis that we don't have. We can come back to this. I think Harris wanted to come back to this question. So acknowledge that's there and a limitation, and then we'll move on to the main conclusions and recommendations. And this is from in the executive summary. First, we have some sort of recommendations identified by survey respondents. They didn't always provide a lot of detail, but I think topically they're interesting and useful for thinking about where efforts might be focused. Similar slide, similar set of information for findings based on the engagement focus groups and interviews. Just very quickly, recommendations about how the state could do a better job supporting the workforce. Solutions have been identified that may help address businesses' challenges. And then additional thoughts. We asked an open-ended question on what could be done to support the workforce. So I will pause on this, take feedback. We have a couple more slides, well, several more slides, one with the engagement conclusions, and then the recommendations.
Courtney.
Yeah, so this was an area that I sort of wondered moving forward. We kind of keep talking about gap analysis and some of the weaker spots, and some of these responses seem important to me when I'm looking at the data and saying, do things like regulatory reform, like how did you factor this input into some of the conclusions or data, or identifying of places where more research or better data is needed? Like, is there strong correlation happening in this report between these items and the reports? And it maybe I just wasn't picking it up very well.
Yes, well, thank you for that. I mean, these are things recommended by survey respondents, and what we try to do with the recommendations was pull out common themes from, across the analysis, quantitative or qualitative. So some pieces of what you see here do show up in the recommendations, and we'll walk through those as well. And if you didn't see that connection, we can certainly talk about it.
Any other comments or questions on this particular slide?
Then interviews and focus groups, big themes. There's more and more detail in the report, but big one was public perception and storytelling, how to better communicate to the public and potential workforce in particular, tell the story of the industry as it exists, what it's doing to support climate resilience and so on, and making that the connections between some of those things that I think anecdotally and in the data are important to younger individuals trying to figure out what to do with their lives, that the industry maybe has not been able to tell as convincingly as it could, and this is a place where the state could help as well. And then also we talk about insights to inform future action. Some of it is related to the first bullet, private employers needing more visibility into youth programs, need to understand what's actually going on and how those programs can support them, and so on.
Go ahead, Julie.
Thanks. I wanted to just briefly bring up, when you're talking about the youth education programs, one thing in the report, there was quite a bit of work put into identifying programs in other states, which is always helpful, but I also think there was a gap in identifying a lot of the programs that are occurring in Oregon, such as Forest Forever, Forest Stay Forever, OFRI programs, Oregon Envirothon. There's quite a few programs who this is their whole focus, is connecting industry and workforce and trying to do other things. I felt like there was a gap in those. So just wanted to bring that up and talking about, a simple statement saying forestry education is not related to industry. There are some groups that's their entire focus is trying to do that. And it feels like that was again another area that we maybe had a miss on aligning more of the Oregon programs, and there was more focus on listing programs from other states that aren't necessarily had any connection with what we're doing here.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And did see those comments from you, and I think Amanda maybe had some similar comments, and we are working on that. Obviously, we can't go out and do a complete inventory, but we do have some additional information that we will bring to bear in the report.
Thank you, Julie. Any other questions on those two pieces? Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, then last piece here is the recommendations spread across some slides here. Well, you can read the words, but first, recommendations on how the state could better support the sector's workforce. A little bit of redundant. Whoops, sorry, backed up. Okay, sorry. Promoting the sector and reducing the size of awareness gaps related to the findings from the survey and what other people had said. Encouraging collaboration among training programs and employers. Again, echoing some of the statements in prior slides. Supporting early and ongoing development of a skilled, diverse workforce. This is getting into some of those youth programs and their importance, just to help students at as early an age as possible understand what is the forestry industry and what does the job look like there. So I think what I'll do is I'll walk through all the recommendations and then take feedback. We can pop back and forth. Also have another set of recommendations here, and this is policy review in particular. We heard a lot of concern about specific regulatory barriers and so on. So we have a recommendation on reviewing policies, plans, and regulations that seems pretty critical to improving the way the state supports the workforce and industry generally. We've talked a lot about data limitations throughout, so we recommend improving data collection about the industry, in particular about the training and education pathways, linking data sets together, but also about better characterizing the industry generally. Perhaps it's a survey that's more regular and disseminated more widely, similar to the survey that we did, to again get better information about sort of the overlap in industry operations and the actual occupations relied on and types of contractors relied on in the field that are not well represented in the administrative data. Mentioned issues linking apprenticeship data, same to employment data. A similar story could be told about CTE, where the state knows about its students and employment outcomes for many of them. It should be easier to get access to findings from research on those connections to better understand how specific programs are actually supporting the industry. And then finally, again, this is, whoops, why does this keep going backwards? Oops. I guess these are sort of a little bit repetitive, but a recommendation based on our findings to find ways to improve public perception about the industry and the opportunities in the sector, and some specifics on how we could inform future action. So those are the recommendations, and happy to take feedback on anything you saw in the report, in the slides here, comments, suggestions.
Thank you, Andrew. For the sake of time, I'll definitely ask if anybody has comments. Now would be a good time before we do kind of talk a little bit as a committee on the gap analysis piece that was determined, particularly kind of in the initial contract wording, and Craig or really any other committee member specifically that sat on maybe the selection process and kind of had a deeper dive into the contractual wording. Wants to provide any input, now would be a good time, because that's kind of what I'm seeking is if that scope of work was specifically outlined in the contract. I think that's important for us to know, or at least touch on, because as Andrew said, the 24th is kind of and as Craig kind of boldly approached earlier, that I wouldn't be surprised if there was open opposition when we see kind of the report with the addition of some of the stuff that ECHO learned today. If we don't see some of that stuff in there, I think a lot of the committee won't be happy with the end result, which we wanted some of that stuff that directly relates to a gap analysis. So does anybody have any input on that? And ECHO, feel free to, Melissa or Andrew, to chime in if that was something that was called out specifically in the scope of the contract. Go ahead, Mindy.
Well, I don't want to speak for others who might have more details, but I just pulled up these scope and statement of work from back in June of last year. And I think I can just copy and paste what seems like the most relevant bit into the chat. But it does, where I see it fitting in is it says assessing current and projected forestry workforce needs, identifying challenges faced by the forestry sector in retaining and recruiting the forestry workforce, and developing recommendations to enhance the recruitment and retention of forestry workforce. And I think some of the stuff we just see addresses that, but I would say that the projected forestry workforce needs maybe is where it might be a little lacking.
Well, I agree. Oh, sorry. I agree with the input and the desire for the gap analysis. But Mindy, thank you for reading that. We do have a section in the report that presents OED's occupational projections and have some language about how that relates to some of the other work. So I think we do have a forward-looking piece. And I guess I would say you don't have to be sympathetic, but within the confines of this study, we have identified the challenges, I think, largely through the engagement that employers are seeing, as well as challenges in the data that make it more difficult than it should be to sort of quantify some of these needs going forward.
And I do, and then I don't want to speak for the whole committee when I say, but like, you know, I know from the very get-go, a big piece of this was that we wanted it to be, you know, a living, breathing, usable study. And I feel like there definitely are pieces within here that suffice for that. And I think maybe the only feedback you're getting in terms of wanting more when we look at kind of productive recommendations and looking at where the gaps may exist falls within, you know, finding some of the data that was already out there, but then also looking at, you know, how that gap can be filled in a way that's productive moving forward. So, Amanda, did you have a comment you wanted to make? I saw your hand was up and then put it down. Now's the time.
Yeah, I mean, I just pulled up the same thing that Mindy did, so I was doing that. But I guess the other thing that I would mention, and just to put it on the record, but there's probably not enough time now to make this effort. But you know, initially there was some discussion within the committee about highlighting you know, recommendations based on type of employment. So, you know, there's kind of like I kind of consider sort of like recommendation soup. There's a bunch of stuff here outlined. Some of it is maybe more relevant to different types of employers or different types of employees than others, and having some organization around that could be useful in, you know, bucketing it for, you know, for a equipment operator, you know, and there's some of that in there around, like, you know, career technical education pieces are probably more important for some of those entry-level operations and type jobs. But some of that kind of grouping might have been more helpful as we, as an industry and a sector, try to wrap our heads around how, you know, where do we go from here? And what, you know, who might be on first with different recommendations that relate to the folks that they represent or the type of company that they are. But, you know, I think that there's enough here for us to do something with it. I just would, you know, would have been nice to see a little bit more organization in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Courtney, go ahead.
I think we've been saying gap analysis, and I think that it's because that is language that what I've been thinking about is what I'm trying to understand is the projected need, and, you know, looking forward, what are the projected needs? Because I think what we run into is we look for resources or adjustments or modernizations and programs, and the first question we get is, well, what's the projected need or target that we are innovating to? And so whether it's gap analysis or it's recommendations targeting a future projected need, that's the part in here that I'm not pulling out I'm not reading it. And I skimmed it last week, so I apologize. It wasn't a detailed, but I was just sort of thinking, I think that's the part is we project the industry, we'll go to these places if we're asking the HEC or other organizations to modify programming to meet that need. What is this report pointing to help inform that recommendation?
Thank you, Courtney. Yeah, I think just as a knee-jerk kind of piece. I mean, the current slide that's on our screens right now, the second bullet point, I think is just kind of a good example, at least of how I'm viewing maybe the lack of that, where, you know, it's encouraged collaboration among training programs and employers, and it goes on to talk kind of about what that means, but there's no actual, like, I think, tangible recommendation on how that collaboration can be encouraged or how that need can be met. I think that's, for me, I think I was just reading that and I was looking at, like, for me, that kind of suffices for what I wish I would have saw a little bit more in terms of specificity and whatnot. But moving forward, I know Craig, myself, and Todd will definitely be talking offline. And I would encourage, if any of the committee has any particular questions, they can reach out. I don't want to extend ECHO's info and say you can reach out to them if you have any needs or questions. But I mean, Andrew, you can elaborate on that if that would be useful or not. I know there was a lot covered today, and I know there's probably a lot of different notes taken. And so if you'd like any of the feedback that was taken in particular that maybe some committee members had put down on paper, that may be something useful to have in your hands between now. But yeah, any closing comments? Anything, Craig? Would you like to add anything? I mean, somehow 2 hours wasn't enough. I think some of us maybe thought that might have been the case, but it flew by, and there was a lot of really productive conversation surrounding what we saw. And I do recognize the efforts that were put in, Andrew. I want to definitely say that as well, that there was a lot of effort put into the study. I see that.
Appreciate that. And yeah, in terms of additional feedback, I think we have captured what was spoken and in the chat, but if there's anything else, you've written down or how figure it out offline, then yeah, please send us that as quickly as possible.
Craig, any closing remarks?
No, I don't think so. There's this thing is fraught with points of struggle and some enlightening information. I can tell you right now, if I'm a harvest sector employer right now, I don't know that I'd read this. So I'm hoping Amanda and her folks can tell me that when we get to the end of this, it was useful to their members.
Thank you, Craig. Yep, with that said, folks, it's 12. I'll give you back your afternoon. But like I said, you have Craig and I's information, Todd's. Feel free to reach out individually or as a group. And also, I think it sounded like if there's any particular communication you'd like to talk to ECHO about, feel free to reach out to them. Feel free to CC Craig and myself in that communication as well. With that said, I sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. It's an absolute wonderful committee chock full of good information and real life experience. So thank you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.